Welcome to the Beyond the Basics guide for the Canon 5D Mark III. This is a great camera that will capture amazing images as well as HD video. We hope you'll enjoy learning more about it with this instructional guide. This guide is meant to be a study tool to be used in connection with and not a replacement of your camera's owner's manual. You can watch it entirely in one sitting or by chapter. Feel free to navigate to any specific chapter you wish to view at any time during the video. Please note that this guide does not cover many of the more basic features and functions of the Mark III, as those topics are discussed at length in our original guide. Rather, this guide will help you move forward with your knowledge of your camera to help take the best pictures possible. The 5D Mark III has an impressive 22 megapixel full-frame image sensor, a large 3.2-inch LCD, a 61-point autofocus system, and many other great features and functions that we'll discuss in this guide. Let's get started. Your Mark III has many buttons, dials, and features that are fully customizable. By customizing the functions of your camera, you'll be able to access your most frequently used settings and make your camera even more intuitive. Making changes to the functions of the customizable buttons can be done in two ways. First, you can make changes using the camera's menu system under the Custom Function Settings menu. Here, navigate to the second Custom Function menu and select Custom Controls. The other way to access the custom controls is in the Quick Control screen. Press the Quick Control button and select the Custom Controls icon. Here you can customize the functions of many of the camera's buttons and controls. First, there is the shutter button, which can be customized with one of three different functions. The first and default option is metering and AF start. When this option is selected, pressing the shutter button halfway will activate the exposure meter and the autofocus. The next option, metering start, will allow you to activate only the exposure meter when the shutter button is pressed halfway. The last option is AE lock. When this option is selected, pressing and holding the shutter button halfway will lock the exposure setting, which will allow you to recompose the shot and keep the desired exposure setting. The next customizable button is the AF on button with 6 different options. First, there is the metering and AF start option. When this option is selected, pressing the AF on button will activate the exposure meter and autofocus. You can also have the camera instantly switch to a specific pre-registered AF point with this option. To register a specific AF point to use, first make sure the camera is not set to use the zone AF. Then select the AF point you'd like to register manually. Now press and hold the AF point selection button and press the LCD panel illumination button. You'll hear a beep sound to indicate that the selected AF point has been registered. Now if we go back to the Custom Controls menu, AF on button, and press Info to set the AF start point, we can select Registered AF Point. Now when the AF on button is pressed, the exposure meter will be activated and the camera will instantly switch to and focus with the AF point that was registered. The next option for the AF on button is AE lock. When AE lock is selected, you can press the AF on button to lock the exposure. Next, there is the AF stop, which will allow you to stop the camera from autofocusing while the AF on button is held down. AF stop is convenient when you'd like to lock the focus while the camera is using the AI servo focus mode. Next, there is FE lock, which will allow you to press the AF on button to fire a pre-flash and lock the flash exposure setting when you're using an optional flash unit. The next option is AE lock hold. Like the AE lock function, AE lock hold will allow you to lock the exposure, and the exposure will remain locked until the button is pressed again. The last option for customizing the AF on button is off, which will disable the button's function in the camera shooting modes. The next button that can be customized in the Custom Controls menu is the AE lock button. The first and default option for this button is AE lock, which will allow you to press the button to lock the exposure settings. After the picture is taken, the AE lock will be released. The next 4 options are metering and AF start, AF stop, FE lock, and AE lock hold. Each of these options function in the same way they do for other customizable buttons. The next button that can be customized is the Depth of Field Preview button, which has 12 different options. The first and default option is Depth of Field Preview, which will allow you to check the depth of field for a picture before it's taken. The next option is AF Stop, which will allow you to press the button to stop the camera from autofocusing. Again, this is useful if you want to lock focus in the camera's AI servo focus mode. The AE Lock option will allow you to press the Depth of Field Preview button to lock the exposure settings. The next option, One Shot AI Servo, will allow you to press and hold the Depth of Field Preview button to temporarily switch between the One Shot and AI Servo focus modes. This is useful for times when you're photographing a subject that frequently starts and stops moving. The next option, IS Start, will allow you to press the Depth of Field Preview button to activate the image stabilization that is available on certain lenses. Note that this function will work only if the stabilizer switch on the lens barrel is set to on. The next option is Switch to Registered AF Function. With this option, you can press the Depth of Field Preview button to instantly switch to the AF function that you have registered. To view the options that you can register, press the Info button. Now you can use the multi-controller to select one or multiple options for the camera to instantly switch to when the Depth of Field Preview button is pressed. Settings with a check mark will be registered and recalled when the Depth of Field Preview button is pressed. To modify any of the settings, use the multi-controller or quick control to select it, and then make the desired adjustments. The next option for customizing the Depth of Field Preview button is One Touch Image Quality Setting. When selected, One Touch Image Quality Setting will allow you to press the Depth of Field Preview button to instantly switch the image quality to the setting you have selected. After the shot is taken, the image quality setting will switch back to the previous image quality setting. To select the image quality setting for this function, simply press the Info button and make your selection. The next option, One Touch Image Quality Hold, functions in the same way as One Touch Image Quality, except that with the Hold option, the camera will continue to use the selected image quality setting until the Depth of Field Preview button is pressed again. The next option for the Depth of Field Preview button is FE Lock, which allows you to press the button to fire a pre-flash and lock the flash exposure setting. The next option for the Depth of Field Preview button is Viewfinder Electronic Level, which will display an electronic level using the camera's AF points in the viewfinder when the button is pressed. The next option, Switch to Registered AF Point, will allow you to instantly switch to a registered AF point when the button is pressed. You can further customize this option by pressing the Info button. Here you can choose to have the camera switch the AF point only while the Depth of Field Preview button is held down, or you can choose to have it switch each time the button is pressed. The last option for customizing the Depth of Field Preview button is AE Lock Hold. When selected, AE Lock Hold will lock the exposure setting when the button is pressed, and the exposure setting will remain locked until the button is pressed again. The next button that can be customized is the Lens AF Stop button, which is available on certain Canon lenses. For this button, there are 8 different options. The first and default option is AF Stop, which will allow you to stop the camera from autofocusing. The next option is Metering and AF Start, which will allow you to press the button to activate the exposure meter and autofocus. Next, there is AE Lock, which will allow you to press the button to lock the exposure setting. Next, there is One Shot AI Servo, which will allow you to toggle between the camera's One Shot and AI Servo focus modes. The next option is IS Start, which will allow you to activate the image stabilization feature of the lens when the button is pressed. Next, there is Switch to Registered AF Function. You can select one or multiple settings for this option by pressing the Info button. Next, there is AE Lock Hold. With this option, the exposure setting will be locked when the button is pressed, and it will remain locked until the button is pressed again. The last option for the Lens AF Stop button is Switch to Registered AF Point, which will allow you to instantly jump to a registered AF point. The next button on the 5D Mark III that can be customized is the multi-function button with 6 options. The first option is FE lock, which will allow you to lock the flash exposure when an optional flash unit is used. Next, there is AE lock, which will allow you to press the button to lock the exposure settings. The next 2 options are one-touch image quality setting and one-touch image quality setting hold. With both of these options, you can press the info button to select an image quality setting that you'd like the camera to switch to when the multi-function button is pressed. The one-touch image quality setting option will take just one photo with the different image quality setting when the multi-function button is pressed, while the hold option will allow you to continue taking pictures with the different setting until you press the multi-function button a second time. The next option, Viewfinder Electronic Level, will display an electronic level using the camera's AF points in the viewfinder when the button is pressed. The last option for the multi-function button is AE Lock Hold, which will allow you to lock the exposure setting and keep it locked until the button is pressed a second time. The next button that can be customized is the Set button. The first and default option for the Set button is off, which means that the button is disabled in the camera's shooting modes. The next option is Image Quality. When selected, Image Quality will allow you to press the Set button to instantly access the camera's image quality settings. The next option is Picture Style, which will allow you to press the Set button to quickly access the picture style settings. The next option, Menu Display, will bring up the menu system when the Set button is pressed. The next option for customizing the Set button is Image Replay, which will make the Set button function as a second playback button. The next option is Magnify Reduce. With this option, you can press the Set button and rotate the main dial to zoom in on images in the playback mode. The last option for customizing the Set button is ISO Speed. When this option is selected, you can press and hold the Set button while rotating the main dial to set the ISO speed. The next control that can be customized on the Mark III is the main dial. By default, the main dial is used to set the camera's shutter speed in the manual shooting mode. With this option, you can choose to switch the function of the main dial to control the aperture setting in manual mode. The next control that can be customized is the Quick Control Dial. The first and default option for the Quick Control Dial is Aperture setting in manual mode. The next option, Shutter Speed setting in manual mode, will allow you to use the Quick Control Dial to set the shutter speed in manual mode. The next option, AF Point Direct Selection, will allow you to select the AF point manually without pressing the AF Point Selection button first. The next option, Set ISO Speed During Metering, will allow you to use the Quick Control Dial to set the ISO speed quickly during shooting. The last control that can be customized in the custom controls is the multi-controller. The first and default option is off, which will disable the multi-controller's function in the shooting modes. The other option for the multi-controller is AF Point Direct Selection, which will allow you to select the camera's AF point manually without first pressing the AF Point Selection button. There are 2 other buttons that can be customized for specific functions, the Info button and the Rating button. To customize these buttons, we'll need to enter the camera's menu system and navigate to the 3rd setup menu. First, we'll look at the options for the Info button. With this option, you can choose what displays are shown each time the Info button is pressed. You can select or deselect camera settings, electronic level, and shooting functions by pressing Set. When you've made your selections, highlight OK and press Set again. The other button that can be customized in the setup menu is the Rating button. Here you can choose to have the Rating button be used for rating images or for protecting images. Bracketing is a technique that allows photographers to take several versions of the same photo, but with different settings. When exposure is bracketed using 3 images, one of the photos will be properly exposed, one will be slightly overexposed, and one will be slightly underexposed. Then you will have the ability to choose the best image of the 3 or use photo editing software to combine 3 shots, giving the image a broad range of highlights and shadows that are all properly exposed. This technique is often called HDR or high dynamic range. Professional photographers have used bracketing since the days of film to ensure good exposure on important shots. With the 5D Mark III, bracketing is available for exposure and white balance. Let's first look at how to configure the camera for exposure bracketing. The first thing you need to do is set the drive mode. When you're using one of the continuous drive modes, you'll press and hold the shutter button to record the number of frames you'd like. For the other drive modes, one shot will be taken each time the shutter button is pressed. We'll choose the low-speed continuous drive mode using the quick control screen. Simply press the quick control button and use the multi-controller to navigate to the drive mode setting. Here you can rotate the quick control dial to make your selection. The next step to configure the camera for exposure bracketing is to select what type of bracketing you'd like from the menu system. To do this, navigate to the second shooting menu and select Exposure Compensation AEB or Auto Exposure Bracketing. You can select the bracketing increment or the amount of variation you'd like between shots by rotating the main dial. You can choose a very small bracketing increment, or if you'd like to see more variation between your shots, you can choose a larger increment. The larger the number, the more variation in exposure there will be. If you select a smaller increment, like 0.3, the images will have less variation. Now, all we need to do is take a few pictures. As always, we'll press the shutter button halfway to focus and the rest of the way down to take the picture. Since we're in a continuous drive mode, we'll hold the shutter button down to record the bracketed images. The first shot will have the standard exposure setting, the next one will be underexposed, and the last shot will be overexposed. Just like we can bracket the exposure, we can also bracket the white balance. Doing this will allow us greater control over the color of images, particularly in tricky lighting situations. We'll have best results if an appropriate white balance setting has been selected or if a custom white balance has been taken. To bracket white balance, enter the camera's menu system and navigate to the second shooting menu. Here, select White Balance, Shift, Bracket. Now you can rotate the quick control dial to select the color variation you'd like the camera to use for the bracketed shots. If you rotate the quick control dial to the left, the green and magenta will be bracketed. And if you rotate the quick control dial to the right, the blue and amber colors will be bracketed. In the bracket box on the right side of the screen, you can see the amount of bracketing that will be applied. You can rotate the quick control dial to select the amount of variation you'd like between the bracketed shots. Choosing 1 will give the images a small amount of variation, and choosing 3 will give the images a greater amount of variation. When white balance is bracketed, only one picture needs to be taken, and the camera will automatically generate the bracketed copies of the image. As discussed, you can choose to have either the green magenta tones bracketed, or you can choose to have the blue amber tones bracketed. If you select the green magenta tones, the first shot will have the standard setting, the second shot will have increased magenta tones, and the last shot will have increased green tones. If you choose to have the blue amber tones bracketed, the first shot will have the standard white balance setting, the second shot will have increased blue tones, and the last shot will have increased amber tones. The Mark III has a feature for creating multiple exposures as well as a feature for HDR photography. These features are great for creative and artistic shots. First, we'll discuss the multiple exposure function on your camera. In film and digital photography alike, a multiple exposure is created when the film or image sensor is exposed 2 or more times to 2 or more different images. The final image has the additional image or images superimposed over the first. This photography technique is useful for creating artistic effect, and is most commonly used when photographing fireworks, lightning, or superimposing a bright moon on a daytime scene. Let's walk through how to set up your Mark III to shoot a multiple exposure image. Enter the camera's menu system and navigate to the third shooting menu. Here, select multiple exposure. For the first setting, you can choose disable, on function and control priority, or on continuous shooting priority. If you select on function and control priority, you'll be able to easily check the results of the image as you're creating the multiple exposure. With the on continuous shooting priority setting, continuous shooting speed is significantly slower than normal, but you can still capture a multiple exposure image of a moving subject, for example. The next option, multiple exposure control, is where you can choose how you'd like the camera to calculate the exposure for each of the shots. If you select additive, the exposure of each individual image will be added cumulatively. This is a good option to select if you're using a technique called masking, where one part of the lens is covered for the first shot and the opposite part of the lens is covered for the second shot. If you're not using the masking technique with the additive setting, you'll want to set a negative exposure compensation to ensure a properly exposed final image. The average option will automatically set the exposure values between the shots to ensure a properly exposed final image. The last two options, bright and dark, will have the camera add and compare the brightness or darkness of the base image, and only the bright or dark area will be left in the final image. The next option that we'll need to select is the number of exposures. With your 5D Mark III, you can choose from between 2 and 9 exposures to be combined to make the final image. Next, we'll need to choose what we'd like the camera to do with the images that are used to create the multiple exposure. If all images is selected, the camera will save each of the images individually, as well as the final multiple exposure. If result only is selected, the camera will only save the final multiple exposure image. The last setting in the multiple exposure menu is continue multiple exposure. With this setting, you can choose to take just one multiple exposure image and then return to normal shooting. Or you can choose to shoot multiple exposure images continuously until multiple exposure shooting is canceled by selecting disable for the first option in the multiple exposure menu. After you have made your selections in the multiple exposure menu, simply take the number of shots that you selected for number of exposures, and the camera will combine them to create the final multiple exposure image. Another useful feature of the 5D Mark III is the HDR mode, which will allow you to create stunning HDR images directly in camera. HDR stands for High Dynamic Range. It's a technique that is used in photography to create captivating photos of dramatically lit subjects. The HDR effect is created when 3 differently exposed images are combined to create a single photo that shows a super realistic range of shadows and highlights. To capture an HDR photo, press the Creative Photo button and select HDR. Here you will see several options. First, there is the Dynamic Range setting, which will determine the level of variation in exposure between the shots that will be combined to make the final image. You can choose Auto, 1, 2, or 3 exposure steps. Choosing 1 will combine 3 images with slight variation in exposure, and choosing 3 will combine images with more dramatic differences in exposure. Next, there is the Effect setting. You can choose from Natural, Art Standard, Art Vivid, Art Bold, and Art Embossed. The natural setting will preserve a wide range of tones that would otherwise be lost. Art Standard will preserve more detail than natural, but the image will also have less contrast and appear flatter. Subjects in images taken with Art Standard will have outlines around their edges. The Art Vivid setting will create an HDR image with more saturated colors than the Art Standard setting and will create a graphic effect. The Art Bold setting will create an image that is the most saturated and will make the subject pop with the look of an oil painting. The last setting, Art Embossed, will capture an image with low saturation and contrast. Overall, the image will appear flat and old, but with bright or dark outlines at the subject's edges. The next setting you'll need to select in the HDR options is Continuous HDR. You can choose to have only one shot be HDR, or you can choose to have every shot be HDR. Next, there is Auto Image Align, which will automatically align the 3 images that will be combined to create the final HDR image. If you're using a tripod, you'll want to set this to Disable. If you're hand-holding the camera, you'll want to choose Enable. The last option to adjust is Save Source Images. If you select all images, the camera will save all of the photos that were used to create the HDR image as separate files. If you select HDR image only, the camera will only save the final HDR image to the memory card. When you're finished making your selection, simply take the picture as you normally would. The camera will take 3 shots at high speed and combine them to create the HDR image. In addition to capturing impressive high-resolution still images, the Canon 5D Mark III can record full HD movies. Note that because the basic features of the camera's movie mode were covered in detail in QuickPro's original guide for the Mark III, we'll primarily be looking at more in-depth features and functions of the movie mode. Let's first take a look at the options for customizing many of the camera's movie mode functions. The customizable features are found in the 4th and 5th shooting menus. The first option is the AF mode for live view and movie shooting. Next, there is the grid display. By default, the grid display is set to off, but many photographers use a grid display when shooting movies to help ensure that the scene is level and to help with composition. The 5D Mark III has 3 different grid display options. First, there is the 3x3 grid. This option will display a rule of thirds style grid on the live view and movie shooting screen. There is also a 6x4 grid. The 6x4 grid is especially helpful when you want to make sure that the image is not tilted. The last grid option is 3x3 plus diagonal. You can create a striking composition with this grid option when you place the subject at any intersection of the lines. Just as with still image shooting, it's important to select the resolution or movie recording size for your scenario. With the 5D Mark III, there are 3 different movie resolution options, each with several different frame rate and compression options. Let's discuss the movie recording size options now. When the live view movie switch is set to movie, the movie recording size options will be available in the camera's 4th shooting menu under Movie Recording Size. Choose one of the 4 options on the left. 1920 by 1080 will allow you to capture full HD video. Use this when you want the highest resolution video the camera is capable of recording. The top 2 options on the right side of the screen, 1280 by 720, are good options when you want to have high quality video, but it doesn't need to be full HD. The bottom option on the right side of the screen is 640 by 480. This is a lower resolution setting that is good for when you only want to use the movie for emailing or posting online. Choosing 24 frames per second will closely imitate the look that you would get if you were using a film video camera. 30 frames per second is more like what you would see on television. 60 frames per second option is a good option for recording fast action video. In addition to the movie recording size and frame rate, there are 2 different compression options on the Mark III. IPB and All-I. The IPB compression method will compress multiple frames at once for more efficient recording and smaller file sizes. The All-I method will compress the frames one at a time for a movie file that is more suited for editing, but will also be a larger file. The purpose or use of the finished video will help you decide which recording size, frame rate, and compression method to use. Keep in mind that the higher the resolution, the larger the file sizes will be. When you're shooting movies, you can customize the way that you'd like to have the time code recorded. The time code is the way that a time reference is recorded with the movie and is used to synchronize the video and audio. The way that the time code is recorded can be customized in the menu system. Make sure that the live view movie switch is set to movie and enter the camera's menu system. Navigate to the 5th shooting menu and select time code. Here you'll see that there are 5 different menu items to customize. First, there is the Count Up option. For Count Up, you can choose from Record Run or Free Run. If Record Run is selected, the time code will only count up while you're actually shooting a movie. If Free Run is selected, the time code will count up regardless of whether you're shooting or not. The next option in the timecode menu is Start Time Setting. For this option, you can choose from Manual Input Setting, Reset, or Set to Camera Time. If you select Manual Input Setting, you'll be able to set the hour, minute, and second freely. If you select Reset, the time for both Manual Input Setting and Set to Camera Time will be reset. And if you select Set to Camera Time, the hours, minutes, and seconds will be set to match the camera's internal clock. The next 2 menu items in the timecode menu are Movie Recording Count and Movie Playback Count. For both of these options, you can choose to have either the recording time or the timecode displayed on the LCD monitor. If recording time is selected, the time that has elapsed since the beginning of movie recording or playback will be displayed. If timecode is selected, the timecode will be displayed. The last menu item in the timecode menu is Drop Frame. When enabled, the Drop Frame option will automatically correct the discrepancy in the timecode that is caused when certain frame rates are used. The 5D Mark III has a feature called Silent Control, which will allow you to silently make adjustments to a variety of camera settings when recording movies. When enabled, you can silently make adjustments to the aperture, shutter speed, ISO, exposure compensation, and sound recording level settings. By default, the Silent Control setting is disabled. To enable this feature, make sure that the Live View Movie switch is set to Movie. Then enter the camera's menu system and navigate to the 5th shooting menu. Here, select Silent Control and Enable. The last menu item in the 5th shooting menu is Movie Shooting Button. With this option, you can choose which button or buttons you'd like to use to start and end the recording. By default, the Start-Stop button only is selected. With the other option, Shutter button and Start-Stop button, you can begin and end movie recording with either of those buttons. Note that when Shutter button and Start-Stop button is selected, the Shutter button will be disabled for still image shooting in movie mode. With Canon's wide array of lenses and accessories, you'll be able to take amazing photos and further build your photography skills. Please note that using some third-party accessories, particularly flash units and multi-power packs, can cause damage to your camera and may void your Canon warranty. You'll want to check with your authorized Canon dealer or service representative for more information about the use of third-party accessories. With the wide variety of lenses in Canon's current lineup, it can seem overwhelming to know what lens or lenses will help you with the type of photography that you're doing. One of the things you'll need to consider when you're shopping for a Canon lens for your Mark III is whether the lens is EF or EFS. Canon EF lenses are fully compatible with the Mark III and are indicated by an EF on the lens barrel. Canon EF lenses will allow you to use the entire area of the image sensor. Canon's EFS lenses are not compatible with the Mark III and are indicated by an EFS on the lens barrel. There are also some Canon lenses in both the EF and EFS formats that are referred to as L-series lenses. These lenses are known for their stunning clarity and performance. These lenses are differentiated from other lenses with a bold red ring around the barrel. Let's talk a little about lenses and apertures. When shopping for a lens, you'll notice that all lenses have a maximum aperture or f-stop. Smaller numbers like f1.4, f2.8 are considered to be faster lenses because they allow a lot of light into the camera. If your lens has a range of apertures, note that the largest aperture can only be used at the widest focal length. This lens is an f4 lens, and this is how the aperture or aperture range is indicated on the lens barrel. The number or numbers following the 1: indicate the aperture or aperture range. The maximum aperture of the lens is important to keep in mind when you're shopping for a lens, especially if you're planning on doing photography in low light conditions, action or sports photography, or if you're looking to create photos with a very shallow depth of field. After the maximum aperture of the lens, the next thing that you'll need to consider is the focal length. Canon lenses are available in a wide range of focal lengths, each with its own benefits and uses. The focal length on a lens is the first series of numbers on a lens barrel, and it's measured in millimeters. This lens, for instance, is a 24 to 105 millimeter lens, or the focal length range is from 24 millimeters to 105 millimeters. Lenses that have a range of focal lengths, like this 24 to 105, are zoom lenses. Zoom lenses have the ability to get closer or farther away from the subject without ever actually moving the camera. Lenses that have only one focal length, like a 50mm 1.8 lens, are prime lenses. Prime lenses do not have zooming capability, but many professional photographers prefer them, particularly for portraits, because of the great clarity they offer. With this understanding of focal lengths in millimeters, we can discuss some of the different ranges of focal lengths as well as the lens categories that different focal lengths fall into. Typically, lenses that are less than 50 millimeters are considered to be wide-angle lenses. So the 24 to 105 that we just talked about could fall into the wide-angle range because it goes down to 24 millimeters. Wide-angle lenses are great for landscape shots as well as situations where space is limited and you want to include as much of the scene as possible. Mid-range or normal lenses typically have between 50 and 85 millimeters. This range of focal lengths is great for family snapshots, portraits, and vacations. The 24 to 105 lens also falls into the mid-range category. These lenses are often referred to as walk-around lenses because they are so versatile and can be used for a variety of subjects and shooting scenarios. Telephoto lenses are lenses with over 85 millimeters and are great for getting closer to your subject. Sports and wildlife photographers use telephoto lenses extensively to zoom in on the subject. Telephoto lenses are also great for getting amazing close-up shots of flowers or other small objects. If you're photographing very small objects and you want to have the ability to capture even the smallest details, you'll want to look into a dedicated close-up or micro lens. The focal lengths for dedicated close-up lenses range between about 60 millimeters and 200 millimeters. In addition to apertures and focal lengths, there is one more important feature that you should consider when you're shopping for a Canon lens: image stabilization, or IS. Image stabilization will help you get sharp photos at slower shutter speeds. This feature is especially useful in low light conditions and can make the difference between a photo like this and a photo like this. Your Mark III has many fully customizable settings and options. As we've discussed in chapters 1 and 4, you can customize the camera's buttons and dials, but you can also customize a wide variety of other camera functions to fit your personal preference. Let's take a look at some of these settings now. First, let's take a look at some of the customizable functions in the camera's AF menus. In the fourth AF menu, there are several customizable features for the camera's AF system. The first thing that we'll look at is Selectable AF Point. With this menu item, you can choose how many of the camera's 61 AF points you'd like to be able to use for autofocusing. You can choose from 4 different options. The first option, 61 points, will allow you to use all 61 AF points. The next option, Only Cross-Type AF Points, will allow you to use only the cross-type AF points. The 5D Mark III has 41 cross-type AF points, which have more precision when autofocusing than the other 20 AF points. These AF points are the camera's cross-type AF points. Note that depending on the lens that you're using, you may have fewer than the 41 cross-type AF points to choose from when this option is selected. The next 2 options for Selectable AF Point are 15 points and 9 points, which will allow you to use only 15 or 9 of the camera's AF points. The next menu item in the fourth AF menu is Select AF Area Selection Mode. With this menu item, you can choose which AF area selection modes you'd like to enable. Depending on your preferences, you may want to select just a few of the options or all 6. The next menu item that will allow you to customize the camera's autofocus functions is AF Area Selection Method. With this option, you can choose whether you'd like to use only the multi-function button or the main dial to select the AF Area Selection mode after the AF Area Selection button is pressed. Note that if you select main dial, you'll need to use the multi-controller to move the AF point horizontally in the viewfinder. The next menu item is Orientation Linked AF Point, with 2 options. For the first option, same for both vertical and horizontal, the camera will use the same AF Area Selection mode and AF point regardless of the camera's horizontal or vertical orientation. For the other option, Select Separate AF Points, you can select a different AF Area Selection mode and AF point for the camera's horizontal and vertical orientations. Now let's take a look at a few of the menu items in the 5th AF menu. First, we'll discuss the top option, Manual AF Point Selection Pattern. With this option, you can choose how you'd like to be able to scroll through the AF points in the viewfinder. The first option is Stops at AF Area Edges, meaning that when you're scrolling and reach the top, bottom, left, or right side, you won't be able to continue scrolling in that direction. With the continuous option, you can continue to scroll when you reach an edge. The AF point on the top opposite edge, top, bottom, left, or right, will be selected when you continue to scroll. The last customizable AF setting that we'll discuss is AF point display during focus. The first option is Selected Constant. With this option, the selected AF point or points will always be displayed in the viewfinder. The next option, All Constant, will always display all of the camera's 61 AF points. The next option, Selected Pre-AF Focused, will display the selected AF points during selection, before you press the AF on or shutter button, and after focus has been achieved. The next option, Selected Focused, will display the selected AF points during selection, and when focus has been achieved. The last option, Disable Display, will show the AF points only while they're being selected. Now let's take a look at a few of the items in the Setup menu that will allow you to customize several camera functions. First, we'll look at the top menu item in the first Setup menu, Record Function Card Folder Selection. With this option, you can choose the method that you'd like the camera to use to record and store images on the memory cards. Let's first look at the Record Play option, where you can choose which card you'd like to use for image recording and playback. If you select Card 1, images will be recorded to and played back from the CF card. If you select Card 2, images will be recorded to and played back from the SD memory card. Now let's look at the top option, Record Function, with 4 different options. If you select Standard, images will be recorded according to the selection that you made for the Record Play setting. If you select Auto Switch Card, the camera will record images using the card you selected for Record Play, but when that card becomes full, the camera will automatically switch to the other card. If Record Separately is selected, you will be able to set the image recording quality for each card independently. If the last option, Record to Multiple, is selected, the camera will record each image to both memory cards. The last option in the Record Function Card Folder Selection menu is Folder. With this option, you can create additional folders on the memory card for images to be recorded to. This could be useful if you're shooting multiple events or locations in one day, and you'd like to have images from each event stored in separate folders. To create a new folder, press Set, select Create Folder, and select OK. Now you can choose the folder where you'd like to have the images saved on the memory card. Another useful feature on the 5D Mark III is copyright information, where you can enter your own copyright information to be saved on the metadata for each image that is recorded. To enter your own copyright information, navigate to the 4th Setup menu and select Copyright Information. Here you can select Enter Author's Name, press the Quick Control button to enter the input area and use the Quick Control dial and Set button to enter characters. To backspace, press the Erase button. When you're finished, press the Menu button. You can also enter information into the copyright details in the same way. Now let's take a look at the camera's Custom Functions menu, where you can make adjustments to a variety of camera settings to suit your needs and shooting style. The top item in the first Custom Functions menu is Exposure Level Increments. With this option, you can choose whether you'd like the camera to use 1/3 or 1/2 stops when you're adjusting the exposure settings. If you choose 1/3, you will have more settings for aperture and shutter speed to choose from than you would if you selected 1/2. The next menu item is ISO Speed Setting Increments, where you can choose the ISO speed increments you'd like to be able to select. If you choose 1/3 stop, you'll have 3 times as many settings to choose from than you would for 1 stop. Next, there is Bracketing Auto Cancel. With this option, you can choose whether you'd like the camera to continue using the exposure and white balance bracketing settings when the camera is powered off and then back on. If you select Enable, the auto bracketing settings will be cleared when the camera is powered off. And if you select Disable, the auto bracketing settings will be saved when the camera is powered off and then back on. The next item is Bracketing Sequence. With this option, you can choose the order that you'd like bracketed images to be recorded. The first option will record the first image using the standard settings, the second will be underexposed, and the last image will be overexposed. The next option will record the first image underexposed, the second at the standard setting, and the last will be overexposed. The last option will record the first image as overexposed, the second at the standard setting, and the last will be underexposed. The next option, Number of Bracketed Shots, will allow you to choose how many shots you'd like to use for the bracketing feature. You can choose between 3, 2, 5, and 7. The next menu item is Safety Shift. With this useful feature, you can enable the camera to adjust your exposure settings to ensure a proper exposure if the light changes quickly. The first and default option for Safety Shift is Disabled. The next option is Shutter Speed Aperture, which will allow the camera to make adjustments to the shutter speed and aperture settings in the camera's aperture priority and shutter priority modes. The other option, ISO Speed, will allow the camera to use the ISO speed to adjust exposure in the camera's program, aperture priority, and shutter priority modes. Now let's take a look at each of the items in the second Custom Functions menu. The first item is Warnings in Viewfinder. With this option, you can choose to have the camera provide a visual warning when certain settings are enabled or in effect. The warning options include when monochrome picture style is set, when white balance is corrected, when one-touch image quality is set, when ISO expansion is used, and when spot metering is set. You can use the Set button to select or deselect any of the options. And when you've made your selections, highlight OK and press Set. The next menu item is Live View Shooting Area Display. With this option, you can choose the way you'd like the camera to display the scene when you have selected a 3:4, 16:9, or 1:1 aspect ratio. You can choose Masked or Outline. Masked will show only the area of the scene that will be recorded in the final image, and Outline will show the entire scene, but with outlines around the area that will be recorded in the final image. The next menu item is Dial Direction During Shutter Aperture Priority, with 2 options. The first and default option is Normal, which will allow you to rotate the dial to the left to decrease the exposure and rotate the dial to the right to increase the exposure. The other option, Reverse Direction, will allow you to rotate the dial to the left to increase the exposure and rotate it to the right to decrease the exposure. The next menu item is Multifunction Lock. With this option, you can select which controls you'd like to be locked to prevent accidental setting changes when the multifunction lock is set to lock. You can choose to have the main dial, the quick control dial, and the multi-controller locked. You can make your selections using the Set button. When you're finished, select OK and save changes. The next menu item is Custom Controls, which will allow you to customize the buttons and controls of the camera. Each of these options is discussed in detail in Chapter 1 of this guide. Now let's take a look at the menu items in the third Custom Functions menu. First, there is Add Cropping Information. With this option, you can choose to have the camera record the image with the cropping information saved to the metadata. This way, the image will not actually be cropped, but it will be easy to automatically crop the image to the desired aspect ratio when post-processing on the computer. You can choose to add cropping information to images with a 6:6 aspect ratio, a 3:4 aspect ratio, or a 4:5 aspect ratio. Or you can select Off to disable this feature. The next menu item is Default Erase option. With this setting, you can choose whether you'd like Cancel or Erase to be the option that is selected by default when you press the Erase button. Select Cancel if you'd like to avoid accidentally erasing images, and select Erase if you'd like to be able to erase images more quickly. The final Custom Functions menu has only one item: Clear All Custom Functions. This will allow you to reset Custom Functions menu items and options to factory default. Note that the Custom Controls option will not be reset with this option. Your Canon Mark III is a sophisticated camera and will need some basic care and maintenance to keep it in good working condition. Here are some tips for storing your camera. First, when the camera will be stored for long periods of time, keep the monitor cover in place. Also, remove the battery and use the battery cover. Next, make sure that the storage location is cool and dry and does not get exposed to temperatures above 120 degrees Fahrenheit. Avoid storing the camera in areas with high humidity, near televisions, radios, or other equipment that produces strong electromagnetic fields. When you're using the camera regularly, you want to protect it from several environmental elements that could cause damage. The camera should stay dry, and contact with dust or sand should be avoided. You also want to avoid subjecting the camera to sudden changes in temperature. If the camera is cold and it's suddenly brought into a warm environment, condensation or moisture can build up on the camera's internal components. Also, leaving the lens pointed at the sun will cause damage to the camera's image sensor. Finally, make sure that the camera is turned off before you remove the battery, memory card, change lenses, or attach any accessory to the accessory shoe. You'll want to consult your owner's manual for a complete list of care techniques and cautions. Let's talk a little now about ways to properly clean the camera without causing damage. To remove dust or lint from the camera body, a blower or brush is a good tool to have on hand. With either of these tools, you can also clean the lens, viewfinder, and mirror. To further clean the camera body, you can use a soft, dry cloth. Do not use alcohol or any other harsh chemicals. If the camera has been used at a beach, you can dampen a cloth with distilled water to clean the camera body. After the blower tool has been used to remove any dust and lint, you can use a soft cloth with a small amount of lens cleaner to gently clean the lens, monitor, and viewfinder. When you're using lens cleaning fluid, be sure to apply the fluid to the cloth and not to the camera or lens directly. Your Mark III can be set to automatically clean the image sensor each time the camera is turned on or off. To do this, enter the camera's third setup menu and select Sensor Cleaning. You can choose Auto Cleaning, Clean Now, or Clean Manually. If auto cleaning is enabled, the camera will automatically clean the image sensor when the camera is powered on or off. You can select Clean Now anytime that you'd like to clean the sensor automatically. And if you select Clean Manually, the camera's mirror will be locked up to enable you to manually clean the sensor. Step-by-step instructions are available in your camera's owner's manual. When cleaning the image sensor, great care should be taken as damage to the image sensor can easily occur. QuickPro suggests that you contact a Canon authorized service representative for assistance in cleaning the image sensor or other internal camera components. We hope you've enjoyed learning more about your Canon Mark III. We know this new information will give you enough confidence and know-how to take your photography skills to new levels. Remember, you can refer back to any section of this guide at any time. Watch for more QuickPro guides on using newly released cameras. Thanks for watching.